If you've ever thought that a law school discussion is all about dry lectures and complex theories, then you haven't experienced the intensity of a real intellectual clash. One evening at Harvard Law School, among a room full of ambitious faces, an unexpected event unfolded. When a well-known, relentless professor launched a sharp critique of a controversial figure, all eyes in the hall turned to one person. That person was none other than Barron Trump, the youngest son of the US president. Would he choose to remain silent, or would he stand up to defend his family? And if he stood up, how could a young man hold his ground against a professor with razor-sharp arguments? Step into the story to uncover a confrontation that's not just about law, but also about resilience, intellect, and how we define justice in a world full of controversies. Before we begin, let us know which city or country you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button, because tomorrow we'll bring you another inspiring story crafted just for you. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, with golden leaves falling and forming a natural carpet outside Harvard Law School. The school's grand hall, a venue for the most vibrant debates, was packed today. Gentle golden light bathed the polished wooden desks, creating an atmosphere that was both timeless and intense. The rustling of papers, the clicking of pens, and quiet whispers blended into a backdrop for a discussion that everyone knew would be challenging. Standing at the podium was Professor Martha Carter, known as the Phantom of Truth for her incisive and unyielding teaching style. She was famous not just for her intellectually stimulating lectures, but also for pushing students to confront the toughest issues. Today's topic: the distortion of law by power and fame. Her voice rang out, strong and as sharp as a blade cutting through the room's atmosphere. When we think of the wealthy and powerful, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Admiration or suspicion? She paused, her gaze sweeping across the hall like a hawk searching for prey. And no one embodies this conflict more clearly than Donald Trump. A wave of tension swept through the room. The students, from the most confident to the quietest, turned to glance at one another. The murmurs gradually faded, giving way to an almost eerie silence. Most eyes landed on one particular spot in the room, where Barron Trump was seated. The youngest son of the former president maintained an astonishingly calm demeanor. Barron sat straight-backed, his pale blue eyes steady and composed, fixed on the podium, showing no sign of flinching at the veiled accusations aimed at his family. His perfectly tailored black blazer added to his aura of confidence, a stark contrast to the timid image the media had previously painted of him. Professor Carter, noticing the attention shifting to Barron, pressed on without hesitation. If anything, she seemed even more determined. We are living in an era where power is not only used to control but also to manipulate the law. And Donald Trump, with strategies like strategic bankruptcy filings and endless litigation, is the most vivid symbol of this. Her voice rose slightly, emphasizing each word. Such behavior not only erodes public trust in the law, but also sets a concerning standard for younger generations. Barron remained silent. But his silence was not a sign of weakness. It resembled a fortress, steadfast against the raging storm. A few students glanced at him, their curiosity tinged with respect. Meanwhile, Professor Carter continued relentlessly. The saddest part is that power not only distorts the law but also undermines the true meaning of justice. And the question I want to pose to all of you today is this: does anyone in the Trump family truly understand the core value of justice? She emphasized the final question, her gaze like a dagger aimed straight at Barron. The entire hall held its breath. The sharp, intense criticism was no longer just words. They were like arrows aimed straight at Barron's heart, waiting for a reaction. But Barron, with a rare composure, merely smirked faintly, his gaze unwavering. The air in the room was so thick with tension it seemed possible to feel every single breath. As the silence stretched, Barron slowly stood up. "I would like to speak," his voice resonated, deep and calm. All eyes turned to him. Even Professor Carter looked slightly surprised. "Very well, Barron," she said, crossing her arms. "We are eager to hear your thoughts." Barron stepped forward, his gaze steady. "I understand that my father is a controversial figure, but I think we should consider everything within context. His actions, whether right or wrong, need to be examined from more perspectives than just one-sided criticism. Professor Carter smirked faintly. Context, you say? Barron, do you think declaring bankruptcy 4 times to evade financial responsibility is justifiable? Barron nodded, unflinching. I'm not here to justify anything, but I want to ask, does the legal system always function as we expect? My father simply used the rules available, rules that this very system created. If we want change, perhaps we should start by reforming the law instead of blaming individuals. Professor Carter raised her eyebrows, a faint smirk appearing on her face. So, you're saying the fault lies with the system, not with the person exploiting it. Do you know how that sounds, Barron? Barron responded immediately, his voice calm but sharp. I know it sounds like an excuse, but it's actually a reminder. A legal system is only strong when it cannot be exploited. If we don't acknowledge its weaknesses, we'll never improve it. I believe our duty, those of us in this room, is to find solutions rather than assign blame. Professor Carter stepped closer to the podium, her gaze icy. What do you think about frivolous lawsuits, then? Your father didn't just file lawsuits to defend himself, but also to drain his opponents financially. Do you think that's justifiable? Barron didn't waver. I won't deny that it's a tactic, but let's look at it from another angle. Why were those lawsuits able to persist for so long? Is it because the legal system allows it, because the litigation process is overly complex and drawn out? If our goal is justice, then perhaps this system needs to become more efficient and transparent, instead of being a battleground for those who can afford to play the long game. A small ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. Some students began nodding in agreement, while others whispered among themselves. Professor Carter paused, her sharp eyes fixed on Barron, as if assessing whether he truly understood the depth of his own arguments. Finally, she smiled, an enigmatic smile. You are very intelligent, Barron. I'll give you that. But intelligence alone is not enough. We need more than that to truly change the world. Barron nodded, his gaze steady. And I believe discussions like this are the first step toward creating that change. Thank you, Professor, for listening. Professor Carter paused briefly but quickly responded. What about frivolous lawsuits meant to silence opponents? Do you think that's the action of someone who respects the law? Barron took a deep breath, his voice calm yet sharp. Professor, I don't deny that some of my father's actions can be controversial, but I think we also need to consider something. No one is forced into silence if they have enough evidence and perseverance. If the law doesn't side with them, is it entirely the fault of the plaintiff? He paused, looking directly at Professor Carter. The law is a tool. It's not perfect, and that means our responsibility, as students and practitioners of law, is to make it fairer rather than merely using it to judge. Professor Carter raised an eyebrow, her face showing a clear hint of sarcasm. So you're saying every controversial action can be justified if one is persistent enough and uses the right tools? Don't you think that's a double-edged sword? Barron stepped closer to the podium, his voice firm. I completely agree that it's a double-edged sword. But the question is, who wields the sword? If the legal system is strong enough, transparent enough, and fair enough, even the sharpest blade cannot harm justice. The issue isn't with the user, it's how the system protects the vulnerable. A soft chuckle rippled through the back of the room, not from mockery but from subtle agreement. Barron continued, his gaze sweeping the hall. We, the people sitting in this room, are the future of law. If we only sit here to criticize, we'll never progress. But if we start by asking the right questions and finding ways to improve, then we will truly make justice enduring. The room fell silent. A student in the back row quietly clapped. Then a few more joined in, until the entire hall echoed with applause. For the first time that evening, Professor Carter seemed unsettled. You seem very adept at defending your viewpoint, Barron. But I still believe the kind of power your family wields has weakened the legal system. Barron remained unflinching. Perhaps you're right, Professor, but I also believe that power isn't always negative. It can be a tool for change, for building, if used correctly. The issue isn't the existence of power, but what we do with it. Professor Carter looked at him, her gaze gradually softening. She said nothing more. The class ended in silence after that. That evening, Barron received numerous messages from other students. Some admitted they had held a biased view of him and his family, while others commended him for his direct and persuasive responses. Under the dim light of his dorm room, Barron read a message from his mother. "I heard about the discussion today. I'm proud of you." He smiled and replied, "Thank you, Mum. I just did what I thought was right." The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the large library windows, Barron sat in a quiet corner, engrossed in a book. The soft sound of footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, followed by a familiar voice from behind. "May I sit here?" Barron looked up. Standing before him was Professor Carter, holding a cup of hot coffee and wearing an expression vastly different from the previous day. Gone was the sharpness or sarcasm, replaced by a contemplative, indescribable look. "Of course," Barron replied, pulling out a chair for her. Professor Carter set her coffee down on the table, her hands clasped together in front of her. "Barron, I wanted to say that I've been thinking a lot about yesterday's discussion, and I realized that perhaps I was a bit too harsh on you." Barron looked at her, his expression free of resentment or surprise. "I understand, Professor. The discussion was meant to exchange perspectives." Professor Carter nodded, but her face remained tense. "Yes, that's true. But I also realized that sometimes I focus so much on proving my point that I forget there are other perspectives worth listening to. What you said yesterday truly made me reconsider." She paused, her gaze distant. "I've always believed that to protect justice we need to criticize mistakes. But you reminded me that criticism isn't the only way. Instead, we need to create opportunities for dialogue and improvement. For that, I want to apologize to you." Barron smiled faintly, a genuine and gentle smile. "Thank you, Professor. I think the most important thing is that we all learn something from discussions like this." Professor Carter nodded, then stood up, placing a hand on Barron's shoulder. "I hope you continue to stand firm in your beliefs, Barron. The world needs people like you." As she walked away, Barron remained seated, watching her disappear among the rows of bookshelves. He knew that what he had said yesterday had not only changed the mindset of a professor, but had also planted the seed for a larger change, a change that begins with the smallest conversations. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love for you to help spread this message by clicking like and sharing it with your friends. Help us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers. It truly means a lot to us, and will allow us to bring you more meaningful stories. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next story.